The Israeli parliament has approved a new law that may pave the way for the country's government to shut down the Al Jazeera news network. This new law gives senior ministers the power to close down foreign news networks that they deem to be a security risk. In recent months, the Israeli government has actively tried to control and manage media reporting on the situation unfolding in Gaza. The closure of Al Jazeera would create a media blackout at a time where all eyes are on the Israel-Hamas conflict. Let's talk about this with international relations expert Thembisa Fakude. Thembisa, good morning. Thank you very much for your time. I think straight out the gate, let's talk about the fact that you have worked for Al Jazeera in a senior role as bureau chief, but also working in Qatar, Doha as well. And so from that perspective, and you've penned various articles about the news network and its role in reporting on the region and in stories that maybe take a different angle to some of the mainstream media stories. I think we can maybe just foreground the interview by just talking a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's not the first time that Al Jazeera has been threatened in Israel. And by the way, it's not only Israel that has threatened to close down the offices of Al Jazeera. Some offices were closed or have been closed over the past. The United States has also done the same. So this time around, the reason why Israel is doing what it's trying to do is because of what Al Jazeera has been doing in terms of covering the unfolding heinous crimes in Gaza and in the West Bank. And that's why Benjamin Netanyahu wants to shut down Al Jazeera in Israel, but particularly in Israel because Al Jazeera is also one of the very few organizations that has continued to cover the protest inside Israel. We know that over the weekend, thousands of people protested against Benjamin Netanyahu, calling for his resignation. And I think that was the last straw, that what actually irritated him and led him to come to this decision, which was very swift in terms of passing that law that was passed by the Knesset some couple of days ago.
We'll circle back to the law itself and some of the assertions the PM is making, which has led up now to this. We'll also talk about the overwhelming support that it has had in the Knesset. But let's put that aside for just a moment and go inside the region, inside the area itself, to look at, who is still covering the story there and what has been the fate of media in the area.
Well, inside Israel, you have most media organizations are still present inside Israel, or what is known as Palestine Free. So you've got Al Jazeera in the occupied East Jerusalem, and you've got Al Jazeera outside the occupied East Jerusalem, in other words, in other parts of Israel. So there you still have a free movement of journalists and media organizations operating. However, in the West Bank and in Gaza, that's a different case. You know that we've already have about 133 journalists that have been killed, and the major organization, because of its use of indigenous journalists or journalists who are born and bred in Gaza, is Al Jazeera. So Al Jazeera has got at least a dozen of journalists who are continuing to report inside Gaza, and of course we also have Al Jazeera continuing to report in the West Bank. So in those two territories, Al Jazeera dominated the coverage. But at the same time, you've seen a number of Al Jazeera journalists that have been killed, and other journalists from different parts or from other organizations that have also been killed and injured.
I want to go to again what seems to have precipitated this particular move. Netanyahu's position. Al Jazeera has harmed Israel's security, has actively participated in the October the 7th massacre and incited against Israeli soldiers, effectively saying that they are not only embedded in an insidious way, but are also partisan in their coverage.
Well, we know what Al Jazeera has since said after those statements that were made by Benjamin Netanyahu. They've, of course, rejected that as ridiculous accusation. Al Jazeera is a media organization that has proved itself to, and I don't want to be a spokesperson for Al Jazeera, of course I'm no longer there, but they have proved to be a professional, balanced organization that employs, professional journalists who have won awards throughout the world, and Al Jazeera itself has been recognized by its own colleagues around the world as one of the best organizations in the world. They continue to win various accolades because of the work that they do. So, it is supported by that the accusations made by Benjamin Netanyahu are ridiculous. And we know, of course, why he has accused Al Jazeera of being biased and embedded within Hamas and terrorist organization in Gaza. Is because they continue exposing and amplifying his crimes, his continued crimes, and also refusing to resign, notwithstanding that you have these ongoing protests before October 7, by the way, thousands of Israelis who are calling for him to resign. So that's simply why I think he's now pushing for this. He's hoping that, of course, there's going to be a blackout of the coverage, particularly inside Israel, of the ongoing protests.
All right, so we do have calls inside Israel where, there are calls for an election date sooner rather than later. But you do have in the Knesset this particular law having been passed with an overwhelming majority, and it effectively does give the Prime Minister and the Communications Minister in the country that authority now to shut down foreign networks that operate in the region, confiscate their equipment if they believe that they could be a threat or a harm to state security. And as you say, you're not a spokesperson for Al Jazeera, but just from a media and media freedoms perspective, Thembisa, what kind of impact is this likely to have just overall, and then specifically with professionals working under these extreme conditions?
It's going to have some very, very serious impact. And knowing Israel and its brutality towards journalists, you are likely, therefore, to have many journalists either arrested or killed, or they'll simply disappear. So we hope that there's going to be an international solidarity visible and loud enough to condemn what's happening or what's about to happen in Israel. Already, various countries have condemned this as a violation of basic freedom of expression. But again, Iman, I think it's important for us to, stand for principle of journalism. And I was one of those who condemned organizations and institutions, including countries that decided to shut down, for example, Russia Today. And very few of us, or very few from our fraternity of journalism, were loud enough to condemn, irrespective of what RT stood for. But the whole act of shutting down a media organization set precedents. And now I think many of journalists and some within our fraternity find themselves on a back foot in terms of trying to push for support of Al Jazeera. Because when it happened to RT, again, for whatever reasons, many of us were muted. We did not really speak against that, which I think now is given people such as Benjamin Netanyahu to do as they please, and they can, of course, easily quote what happened in Russia as a precedent.
So the White House, for its part, has found, these reports concerning, and they say that they support the work of journalists around the world, including those who are reporting on the conflict in Gaza, that the freedom of the press is important. So they're concerned if this is all as it's being painted and portrayed. The Committee to Protect Journalists, which we know is a global organization that also is about media freedoms, they're a watchdog, say also this poses a significant threat to international media. Not only on war reporting, Thembisa, and I want us to just widen the aperture a little bit in terms of the conditions under which journalists are working globally. You mentioned some of the protest action that have been mounted by journalists to, for example, stop the shutting down of certain news networks. But what do you say, about the climate in the world today when it comes to journalists and journalism? It used to be if you wore, a press badge, or if you wore something that denoted you as the press, you were pretty much guaranteed to be able to work, relatively freely. And that seems to have been changing, at least perceptionally and anecdotally, over the last many years. What can you share in terms of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, sadly, we've had more journalists killed over the past at least couple of years. More journalists have been arrested. Case in point, for example, Shirin Abu Akleh, one of the Al Jazeera journalists who was shot point blank by the Israeli Defense Force. So the situation for journalists is getting even much more desperate, with many of them not protected not only by the laws that govern all these countries from which they are reporting, but you don't have an international body, even though we've got these non-state bodies that seek to protect and promote the safety of journalists. But I think there is also unwillingness from not only the United Nations, but countries as well, particularly outside Europe at least, except for countries such as, few countries such as Germany that is now coming also hard on journalists. But there are very few countries that are actually looking at protecting journalists and making it their business and concern to ensure that journalists operate freely in those countries. The Middle East has been worse, of course, in African countries. You know what's happening in terms of the abduction of journalists, etc. Middle East, journalists simply get killed, others just disappear if they do tell the story. So the plight of journalists and the situation for journalists and the environment through which they operate in remain extremely desperate, and there is a need now to have intervention, I would argue that from the United Nations level.
And that was really going to be my closing question to you, Thembisa, is what needs to happen now, given, that it's there and it's been passed, and those authorities in Israel have been empowered. What does the world need to do? Have we lost Thembisa? He has frozen, not in real life, just from a technological point of view. Oh, okay, he's unfrozen. So, Thembisa, final thoughts.
Sorry about that. I mean, we know what Israel has done. Israel has, violated and ignored instructions and calls from everyone, including the United Nations. So I don't think they'll listen to anyone this time around. So we just have to continue amplifying those voices and making sure that the voices of condemnation are heard, but importantly, to drive a point to Benjamin Netanyahu that the world is watching.
Thembisa Fakude, thank you very much for your time and for sharing your perspective on these developments.